just didn't want to do the introduction.
Oh, you said you'd do it. That's all right.
Okay, great. Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to get us started. In case you don't know me, I'm Joe Krajcik. I'm the director of Krajcik for STEM. But you're not here to know who I am. You're actually here to meet Bryan and hear Bryan talk. So it's my real great honor to introduce Bryan Brown from Stanford, from the University of Stanford, to give us talk about his research. Bryan, throughout his career, has actually done research to try to improve the lives of children in urban districts. And I know that many of us here are also interested in that, and that's why we're here. So we're really looking forward for Bryan to talk about his research and how he improves the lives of children in urban districts. Bryan, and I always look for these things when I read resumes. Bryan's a former high school teacher, right? Biology?
Yeah, biology and chemistry. Yeah.
He has comes up through the rank from teaching all the way to do his wonderful research. I'm going to actually bring out one other notice that everybody should know. Rudy, could you come up here? And Coulter, could you come over here? Okay. What do you see common among them? Pattern recognition. What's the pattern? See any patterns? We all have our flannel shirts on. Today, if you don't know it, it's Wednesdays are flannel days in Create. We're trying to get this tradition going of flannel Wednesdays.
Okay.
So next time, wear your flannel. I see someone back there doesn't even know it. So Bryan, welcome to Create. We're really happy for you to be here.
I also want to say, Bryan, welcome back to MSU. Bryan was a postdoc here many years ago, and we're so we're so thrilled that you get to come back and say hello.
Thank you, Christina. So, you doing all right?
Yes.
All right, I'm trying to check the audio here. Let me see it. Okay, we're good. You're good. All right, so first of all, I have to just start by saying thank you for having me. Unbelievably, 17 years ago, I had no desire to be a researcher. I thought I would go back to the classroom, and someone named Gail Richmond reached out and gave me an opportunity to do a postdoc. And then this here at Michigan State, where I actually decided I think I'll be a science education researcher. So I just want to say thank you publicly for launching me here. And Christina was just getting started at the same time. So it's good to have come full circle. So rules of engagement. So here's what we're doing today. If I talk about it, I learn, right? Hi, Alicia Alonso. Good to see you. We have a lot of familiar faces. If I talk about it, I learn, but I've talked about it often. So it doesn't do me any real benefit for me to talk. What I mean is I might ask you a question. That question is not rhetorical. I want conversation. So the rules of discussion today, conversation. I'll try to talk for about 35 minutes or so, maybe get to 40, but I'll try to keep it brief. I really want to open time for discussion. And so what we're talking about today is excerpts about the research that I've been doing since I left you, which is about how to teach science for inner city students. And I'm going to try to give you a Cliff Notes version. I don't even have Cliff Notes anymore of what the book is really about. All right, so here's the deal. I'm going to talk about big ideas and scholarship in the book, and I'm going to share two small studies just so you can see the kind of research that emerged from the ideas, but the ideas are critical. Then I want to discuss teaching practices. Theory to practice, I think, is vital to what we do. I go to schools, and it does not matter that I'm a college professor. They want to know, do you have a practice that I can use today to do a better job of teaching? And so I've always tried to live at that intersection of the ideas that explain what you're doing and the practices that work. And so I want to talk to you about that and then talk about the future, what we're doing currently to push the field forward. Right? So in the book, and kind of the foundation of the book was this picture. So here's the first question for you. Who is in this picture? Again, not a rhetorical question. I need answers. And as a teacher, I love wrong answers. So give me any answer you're comfortable with. Definitely unhappy people. That's clear. Google it if you need to.
Was the first black man to attend the university?
You got it. His first name is James. His last name is Meredith, right? But this is James Meredith on his way to register for school at Ole Miss University. Now here's the issue. Look at the faces. You already attuned to the faces, right? I forgot. I have this teacher amnesia that kicks in from time to time. Where is he going? School, right? He's going to school to register to get a degree. So look at the faces, right? This is day one. And so I can't imagine what day two looked like. And so the idea is there's a phrase that I was told by my grandmother, I'm gonna go back, it's called the black tax. And it's a very simple idea. And it is the idea that there's inherent racism and social inequality that will be a part of your life. And the only way that you can deal with it, one of the ways rather, is to understand that that's a reality. They call it the black tax, right? So people are not going to assess you the same. So people will expect things that are different. There will be inequitable treatment. And so the question is, what was his black tax? So just imagine turning in your first paper at Ole Miss University, right? Imagine the small group discussions that he was involved in classroom if there was. Imagine the study group invitations that he was not afforded. So what's the end of the story here? Anybody know the end of the story? I'll take a yes or a no. No. He graduated, despite all that opposition, earned a PhD, despite all that opposition. But it is literally the image, this iconic image that made me think, well, what is the modern black tax? And if so, how does it play out in science classrooms? And so I'm going to argue today that one of the foundational subtexts of the conflict or language in black text is what we call linguistic racism. And so I had the fortune or misfortune, I'm not even sure, to have studied with linguists when I got to graduate school. My advisor at the time, Dr. Greg Kelly, was on a leave, so he just wasn't there. So he left me with social linguists for a year. So I read a lot of social linguistic work. So for example, one form of modern black text is linguistic racism. So Labov talked about how we make judgments about who's intelligent based on linguistics. So just a quick think aloud. Don't say it aloud, but think it in your mind. What does a smart person sound like? What does a smart person sound like? What is the accent of the smart person? In your mind, say it. How many people, show of hands, that was an English accent? What's wrong with us? What is it? So much so that when you listen to science documentaries, they're almost always voiced by British voice actors. I could not for the life of me understand why we are these are produced by the Annenberg Foundation, so enthralled with using voices that are not our own. So Labov talks about it. John Richter makes the argument that linguistic norms are left organic and so they reflect cultural standards. So let me say that differently, right? So if we are in a place where no one determines how we are going to speak, then the years and years of normal patterns of speech happen. So for example, when you walk into a classroom, unless the teacher is explicit about here's how we'll communicate in this environment, here's the game that kids know to play. I ask a question, you raise your hand. I only want the person who's raised their hand to have the right answer. I will select that person, and then I will evaluate if that answer is right or wrong. And you, because I know you know about teaching, you tell the teachers we don't want to engage in initiation, response, and evaluation frameworks, but here's the challenge. If linguistic norms are not defined, as we did when we started our discussion, then the norms of society play out, right? So there's a general bias that continues to exist in U.S. schools, and John Ball says this. When I went to college in the 90s. I grew up in Oakland, California, where I started and ended most sentences with the word though. Hey, what time are we going to the store though? What time is closed? What time is the game going on though? Right? It was a cultural and linguistic way of speaking. And when I went to college, people were like, man, you're ghetto. I was like, you should see the people from where I come from. Like, for real? Like, what is ghetto about that? But they had come from a place where people didn't speak the way that I spoke. Does that make sense? Right, so here's the question. What counts as intelligent? What counts as unintelligent? I'm arguing that we have linguistic norms that are connected to race and culture that we never carefully consider, right? So this is called linguistic racism. So I didn't study this, but many people study this. And in my book, I have a chapter dedicated to it, and I focus on this interaction. And so just as a framework, this is, his name is Jameis Winston. He just won the national championship in the football game. I think it was like 2013. So this is seconds after they had come back, they were down. He throws a touchdown, last minute touchdown, they win. Yay, people rush the field, microphones in his face, and this is what ensues.
In this game, final drive, what did you tell your teammates around?
I said, guys, we didn't come here for no reason. I said, guys, this is ours, man. This is all the adversity we went through. The first few quarters, it was ours to take. And like I just said, we control our own destiny. Those men looked me in my eye and they said, we got this, James. And I said, are you strong? They said, I'm strong and you strong. I said, we strong, man.
After struggling through the first half, what was the biggest adjustment you guys made at halftime?
We had to go back to playing Florida State football. We came out here, we were letting us be bigger than the game. We were bigger than the game, then we had to say, hey, let's play Florida State football because can't nobody be bigger than this game. And we did that, and we came out victorious.
You had an embrace with your head coach, Jimbo Fisher. You've been through a lot with him this season. What did you guys share in that moment, James?
We champions. We can say that we are champions together. And through everything that we went through all the haters, through every single thing, we came out victorious. And God did this.
Okay. So I got a chance I watched this, and I'm always in researcher mode. And so I was on Twitter, and I noticed this was trending. And this is, when I get a chance to use Twitter for research, I'm really happy about that. January 7th, 2014, 12:09 a.m., Didi McCarran says, am I listening to English? So just by way of context, does anyone know who Didi McCarran is? If Michigan State can pull this off, I would be very happy. I don't think most academic institutions have no idea who Didi McCarran is. Close, yeah. So her son was the quarterback, A.J. McCarran of Alabama, who didn't make it to the national championship. So thank you, right? Rarely do we know we get the concept. So this is not just any mom, right? This is the mom of a very prominent, I think they won the championship the year before. Am I listening to English, right? So I want you, organic, let's just clear this up. I hate the word organic. Having taught chemistry, I know it means carbon-based structures, but we use it to mean everything but that, right? So when language norms are organic, that means we haven't defined them. So she's saying, am I listening to English? So watch this, right? So 1:39 a.m., she says, anyone that knows our family knows we are far from racist. My tweet was not in any way meant that way. I sincerely apologize if I offended anyone. So apparently some people thought that was a racist tweet, right? And so she responded immediately to try to clarify, right? So we're January, same time, right? This is New Year's. This is days later, right? But same time, 12:10 a.m. This is somebody named Reggie Bush. And he says, I love listening to this dude, Jameis Winston, talk after games. Walks the talk like a true champion, a great role model for kids to look up to. If you know anything about Jameis Winston, that role model thing is a little controversial, but here's the point. Two people hear the exact same thing. And because discourse norms are organic, mean undefined, we hear two different things, right? Just another example. Another person named LeBron James. I'm not sure who this is. Unfreaking believable. Interview by Jameis just shows part of the reason why he's so special. So here's the question, and remember, no rhetorical questions. I want to know, how could she say, am I listening to English and think it's deficient, and then they say it's an amazing kind of post-game interview? I'm curious what your thoughts are. Here's the answer. There are no wrong answers. I'm just curious what you think. I don't have any evidence to say so, but let's assume, yes.
So they have they understand, I think, what he's saying.
Good.
Differently
Good, good. Give me something else. What do you have?
They've experienced the pressure of a post-game interview, and so they sympathize.
Good, good. Give me something else.
Yeah, I mean, they're in sports, so it's like sports talk. Like that seems like how in sports you would talk.
Good, good. Anything else? Yes.
I think she wasn't recognizing that they were different dialects of English.
Sure, sure. So just imagine for a second, post-game interview, touchdown, hey, we won. James, how do you feel? It was a fascinating battle this evening. What I found most intriguing was the manner in which our team stayed focused despite the obvious difficulties of it doesn't even feel right, right? So one person is expecting a particular genre of English, the other person, who's a 19-year-old African-American man from Mobile, Alabama, speaking mostly to other Southern African-American men of the same age group, is in the moment asked to give us communication, and he speaks in the genre that works for him, right? Perceived as deficient. So I'm making a leap, and here's the leap that I'm making. I'm selling a product. Here's the product. I'm making the argument that in our classrooms, we allow organic norms to frame how we hear our students. Additionally, we're allowing organic norms to allow us to confuse our students by not communicating in ways that help our students understand the phenomenon. Here's an example I've been using for years. You might walk into a classroom and say, inside of the cell is the nucleus, but inside of the nucleus is the nucleolus. But inside of the nucleolus is where ribosomes are made, and ribosomes are responsible for protein production, right? Two things you've done for me. You've confused me, and two, you sent me a message. I should not be here. So my first studies were about language and identity and how we use language to cue two things. Number one, there's a message, and number two, I'm telling you how I feel, who belongs. So when you're angry, you probably don't speak in a soft and gentle voice. If you do, that is the most frightening way to be angry, right? Seriously, don't do it that way. We raise our voice, we use creative language sometimes. The content might not change, but the message is different, right? The way that we deliver it. So in science teaching, we have new words for new ideas, but how do we create language norms that maximize student learning? Now, that is a rhetorical question. Yes?
She also had a chip on her shoulder, though.
Absolutely.
Right? So it's how she interpreted it, but she interpreted it with some kind of big, huge chip on her shoulder. I mean, that's how I interpret that, right? Like, because when you played it, I didn't see anything wrong. I mean, it's normal to me,
Right.
But
Right.
she obviously had some beef she wanted to pick.
Absolutely, right? So part of what's happening here is we view language and we view interactions through the lens that we view it through. So how are teachers viewing the language practices of our students, right? So what counts as intelligent, what counts as scientific are all questions that we as educators have to be careful of, because we send messages about who people are through the use of language. So I'm going to walk you through some of this. And so here's the big idea. So Jim G talks about this. We allow language norms to be left undefined. There are studies that are shocking that in southern states, that there's Meredith Kazan talked about the hesitancy for people to use southern accents in hospitals because there's a discriminatory framework that we don't want our physicians to sound southern. Just think about that. I'm in a southern state, and I don't want my physician to sound southern because we've created a negative stereotype around southern dialect and intelligence, right? So Dr. Naila Nasir talks about the inversion of stereotypes, that stereotypes are always indexical, meaning that if they label one group, thereby not defining or speaking directly to the other group, you're then defining them by default. So for example, if I say white men can't jump and that's a stereotype, I'm also speaking about other groups of people. So what does that mean for black men? It's inherent in the stereotype. So part of what we're saying linguistically, here's another way to think about it, cultured music. When we think of the highest order cultured music, like, you know, we use the term art, there's culture, which is the higher order culture, art, music. What music are we talking about? What types of art were we talking about? So here's what we're doing. We're indexing things by having stereotypes. And so by default, we value the culture of power. So John Bowe talks about that. Lippy Green talks about that. An easy example is to think of news broadcasts. There's no reason in the world that news broadcasters should not have regional accents, right? So the people in Michigan do not sound like people in Michigan when I see them on the news, right? They have a concocted Nowhereville accent that all news broadcasters use when the cultural norms of the day, and I'm not talking about the actual slang, I'm talking about how you actually say the word, is what cultural norms tend to be the culture of power, and TV marketers have made a determination that the culture of power is an unrecognizable accent, and so they use that frame. So what does that have to do with science teaching and learning? We went a long way to get there. So chapter 2 and 3 of this book that I just recently wrote talks about how language serves as a primary hurdle in science teaching. This has been talked about in the field for quite some time, but probably not in the ways that I'm talking about. So Halliday and Martin talk about how the grammatical structures and the actual written design of science language does two things. One, it creates a way to create phenomena. So we can talk about a process of condensation, of evaporation, of precipitation. We can give it a noun. It's now a noun. And we say the water cycle or the hydrological cycle. And so we take ideas and we label them. What it does is create for a dense linguistic structure, right, with purpose and efficiency, right? So on one end, that is the power of science language, right? There's the other way around. So here's what happens. Ideas are created and they're labeled second. So before we knew what a double helix was, there were people in a room talking about, well, DNA is twisting, there seems to be a helical structure, and then they give it a name. And so we have this profound linguistic structure. But what do we do when we teach? And that's not a rhetorical question. When we teach students science, what are the norms of teaching the language of science? What do you see in the classrooms?
Vocab first.
Vocab first, yeah. What other things do you see?
Word wall.
Word walls, an amazing word wall, my favorite friend. Right? So we'll get there. So here we go. Science learning involves learning new ideas and new language simultaneously. When you're in a Spanish class, you're getting new words for ideas you already know. But when you walk into a science classroom, we're talking about new ideas in new science terminology. If you ever want to laugh, go look at a chapter on bacteria in a biology book. They use the word plasmid, or my favorite, chromosome, chromatid, chromatin. We're talking about the same thing in different stages, but we have different names. Look at your faces. Y'all, you didn't like that example, right? A lot, right? It's the same thing. So here's the deal. I'll argue theoretically we have this thing called a language identity dilemma in science teaching. And so here we go. So I'm arguing that when we teach science, there's a language and identity dilemma because all language is associated with identity, meaning we can send a message of who I am through the way that I'm choosing to communicate. So I'm trying to pretend to be a professor right now. Right? I promise you I won't cuss in this presentation. I'll probably use words that are a little bit more academic than I probably would use in other contexts because I'm pretending to be a professor, right? It is a language identity exchange that's happening right now. There's two aspects. One of these aspects is cognitive. Here's the cognitive aspect. If you communicate new ideas in new language, you're preventing me from understanding. Now, this is the duh factor. I get this often when people ask me, what do you study? Well, I study, if you use simple language to introduce the ideas to students, they learn better, right? And they go, for real? Like, that's what you do? Pretty much, right? But the issue is if we don't consider that if we introduce ideas in simple language and then we allow students to then practice using the language, that at least now they know the idea. The second is emotional. And so I'm going to walk you through really quickly. Cognitively, I don't understand what is being explained, or a failure to be understood. And then the second is students have answers, but they can explain language that the teacher can't recognize. There's also a failure to understand. So if I'm a young person, I'm asking a young person about some science idea, why would I expect them to use science language, especially if they learn the science idea in a context where science language would just be weird? So if you worked in a garage and learned a lot about engineering and mechanics, and you can tell me about circuits and you can tell me how motors work, you might not be using science language. But can the teacher hear that this person understands that idea? And so from a cognitive perspective, there's two ends of the coin that I don't understand. And when the students communicate, we don't hear what they actually know. The other is emotional, right? And here's the emotional part. I'm frustrated with the jargon, right? I don't speak like this. I should not be here. Think about James Meredith. So if you stand James Meredith in a hall and there's a lecture, you don't think he had doubt? Should I be here in this place? And so what are the communications of doubt? So let me give you another example. Most kids will go to college and they may have had AP chemistry. They sit in that room and it's going to be terribly taught because that's what happens with university chemistry, right? One group of kids, my kids, because their parents went to school, they may say, well, this is just difficult. Another kid could say, well, you know what? Chemistry is not for me, right? And part of what I'm arguing is that's a subset of the emotional context of using complex language. There's a wonderful study by Danny Martin from the University of Chicago, University of Illinois, Chicago, about math history and how the historical frameworks of parents matter. So let me give you a quick example. So he argued he gave kids two problems, easy problems and hard problems, but they're two historical backgrounds. If your parents had a difficult time with math versus if your parents had an easy time with math. Those with the easy time with math, easy problem was easy. When they got to the difficult problem, it was difficult. Here's the subtlety, but here's the difference. People whose parents had a negative history, easy problem was easy. When they get to the difficult problem, they started to think, I can't do math. So you make an attribution to yourself, right, based on this experience. So here's my argument, right? If we allow language to be a hurdle, we are certainly applying the black tax, and I use that broadly to talk about all people of color, all people who feel marginalized. I'm letting you know you shouldn't be in this classroom. All right, so I'm a scholar. I do research for a living. So I'm going to give you a quick snapshot of some of the studies we did to explore this. The first of which is we were curious about what are the alternative ways that students explain phenomena? Could they explain phenomena in ways that scientists might miss? And so I studied a group of kids, inner city students, who were playing baseball and asked them a simple question: how does a curveball curve? So quick science lesson, if you throw the ball this way, I'm going to throw it in the last minute, spin it. I want it to spin as quickly as it can this way. So imagine the ball's traveling that way, spinning this way. Remember, the ball's traveling that way. So the airflow underneath the ball as the ball spinning is going the same direction, right? But on the top of the ball, the airflow is hitting the seams at the top of the ball, right? So what will happen is there's greater air pressure on the top of the ball and the bottom of the ball. Now scientists call this differential air pressure, or they call this a Magnus effect, right? It's why you put spoilers on the back of cars. It's why airplanes have lift, right? If I can create enough air pressure differential, it'll push it up, push it down. So as you throw it harder, the ball will go and it'll dive at the end, right? So that's the idea, and I asked the kids, explain how a curveball works. I want you to listen to this explanation.
Well, when you flick the ball, it cuts through the air. It has different airs under it and over it, and and starts pressing it down, so it drops, and the air on the bottom is more loose in my way, and it just like the heavy pressure makes it drop.
Okay, so I have a job for you. Simple question: is he right or is he wrong? Not a rhetorical question. Where's the confidence? Come on, scholars. It's the Create Center. What's going on?
I think it's important to say, I don't know.
Okay.
I would probe the student more.
Good. It's so teacherly of you. Good act. Other thoughts? Right or wrong?
Well, I'd want to both, in your explanation and in his explanation, I would ask both of you, what do you mean by air pressure?
Exactly. Great.
Right, so I would stand with Bob on this one, in that I would want to do a little bit more exploring with respect to, so this from a macro standpoint, just like yours, seems fine to me, but I'd want to press about what his understanding of air pressure.
My favorite question in science classroom, what do you mean by ... It's beautiful. Yes.
I was just like my pre-service teachers, I would say, well, parts of this look like, things that look about right. It has different airs under and over, so there's this differential. That sounds like that's a pretty good thing to think about. It starts pressing it down, so that's another piece that looks about right. Drops in the air to the bottom, it's more loose. I'm not sure what loose means, but maybe it's like some ease of going through the air the right way. It just makes heavy pressure, so there's some words in there.
Good. That's why I don't ask world-class science educators the question, because they don't fall for the trap I was setting, which is the failure of binary thinking, right? So if you say right or wrong, so here's a different question that I would ask in other places is, how would he perform on the assessment, right? All he needs is clarity around where his ideas are right, where the alternatives are wrong, where the language practices that he needs to know, where they exist. And so, for example, different airs, he could mean oxygen and carbon. In that case, I don't know. If he means the air pressure is different, then yeah.
I would ask him a similar question, but with a different, not a baseball. To see it.
So that's the perfect thing. We transfer. You say, okay, here's a car. Explain how this spoiler thing is similar, right? Cognitive scientists would say we should transfer context to see if they really know. But here's what I'm really getting at, right? He's not using any of the science language. There's not the term air pressure, not Magnus effect. So can our teachers hear he knows a lot, regardless if you want to call it right or wrong? Can you hear it to say, you know what? Great answer. So what do you mean by, and then we can really dig into it. So the argument for me is sometimes the language gets in the way, and we're teaching with organic language norms because we don't set a standard for how the kid should speak. What are the rules of linguistic engagement? So I've been studying this for some time. So we started playing with, when I was leaving here, this notion of disaggregate instruction. So here's this idea. Again, I'm the world's simplest scholar. Why don't we just teach with the simple language first and then say, okay, now different airs, scientists call that air pressure. When you describe it now, as we talk about different contexts, use the word air pressure. So start with simple language, teach the context, and there's one more thing, teach in the context of students' lives, because if they see that phenomenon regularly, right, it's much more difficult to delete that information, right? Allow the students to practice new science language. And so here's the problem if you're me. You think you have something, you need to figure out if it works. Experiments are very difficult. Right? So let's say I need, and I'm just going to vent a little bit. I often do an experiment and write to a journal and say we had 7 schools, we randomized in the classroom, we had teachers alternate, and they say, the sample size is too small. It's like, what? Are you serious? So if you're going to do an experiment, here's the problem. There's this thing called teacher fidelity, is I need every teacher to teach it the same. There's another problem. I need to convince multiple school districts I'm going to teach one group of kids better, another group of kids worse, And you have to agree to allow that to happen. And so that's why we don't really see a lot of experiments in teacher practice. They're just difficult to come by. It's difficult to manage. And so we tried, and here's our solution. Oop, I'm sorry. I went the wrong direction. So here's what we did. We decided we're going to use a software. And we'll have the exact same software with one difference. And so group one, you get science and everyday language. So we'll start with how teachers teach. And so we wanted to create a control group. Here's another problem with teaching. There's no such thing as normal. So what does a normal teacher do? So we could create a straw man argument and says a normal teacher walks in the room and says, today, and they just blabber using all science language, but we know teachers are better than that. What teachers tend to do is they use root words. They have different strategies to say, oh, here's what this means. So we said science and everyday language as the control. Group two is our experimental group. And so what they got was everyday language first, and then we gave them the actual science language. So use both groups pre-test, both groups post-test. So here's what the software looked like, right? So one group, oxygen, carbon dioxide, photons. This was the control group. Experimental group, good air. All living things need for breathing, air that humans breathe out. Where did I get these words? I did a pre-assessment. I just asked them, well, how would you talk about plants growth the year before? And this is what we did. So we did pre-test, post-test, and here's what we found. We had different types of questions. So overall, the treatment group is on the top. Their scores are right around 70% versus slightly under 60% for all items on multiple choice items. Open-ended questions, similar, as the treatment group outperformed at a similar ratio, almost 10% higher than the control group on the open-ended questions, and so we had rubric scored outcomes. And so we then asked the questions two ways. We had disaggregate questions, meaning questions with simple language. So we wanted to make sure the questions weren't the problem either. So we asked questions that were written in simple language and questions that were written in complex science language to see what we were really getting at. In the disaggregate question, so here's the big idea, is across all measures, students in the treatment group who got simple language did much better overall on their capacity to understand and accurately answer the questions, regardless of how the question was asked. Although you notice when the language is complicated, right, that difference was smaller. So even when the question is asked using science language, although all these differences were statistically significant, is when you ask with complex science language, they were smaller, which would suggest that learning science is a difficult part of this teaching and learning process, right? So I want to show you what that looks like in instruction. So then what we've been doing for years is training teachers to teach in the context of kids' lives, use simple language to explain the ideas so that they get an opportunity to really be fluent. And so what we ask our teachers to do is rethink the concept in the context of kids' lives, this pedagogical content knowledge exercise. I want to show you what that looks like. My dear colleague, Jeannie Lithcott, she gave it the name, the 20-second story. And so when we start our teacher ed program, we have our students create very short explanations of phenomena. You're going to hear about the concept of osmosis through disaggregated instruction.
Now, we all know and love the story of Finding Nemo. Father and son get separated. Son makes new friends in a fish tank. Father goes on an epic journey to save his only child. And, following the Disney way of life, everyone ends up living happily ever after. But, what if there was some dark twist lurking in the shadow of the story? What if the dentist who found our tiny orange friend actually gave Nemo to his crazy niece Darla? She doesn't know about marine life, and instead of putting Nemo into a new and friendly saltwater fish tank, she put Nemo into a freshwater fish bowl. Would it really matter? Saltwater, freshwater, I mean, it's all water, right? Would everything end up happily ever after for our little lost clownfish Nemo? No, no way. So what gives? Why can't you put a saltwater fish into a freshwater tank? Well, fish that live in the ocean, like our little friend Nemo, are happy campers when they're surrounded by water. There's salt inside Nemo's body and outside Nemo's body. And nature likes everything to be balanced. And this is exactly what happens for saltwater fish when they're in a saltwater environment. Because again, there's salt on both sides of Nemo's skin. But when you put a fish like Nemo into fresh water, the conditions around him change. Now, unlike his happy home in the ocean, Nemo has more salt in his body than the fresh water around him. Nature hates that there's more salt on the inside than on the outside and wants to balance this out. Now, if we could look through a microscope at Nemo's body, we would see that there's tiny openings in his skin, kind of like doorways. Now, the salt molecules inside Nemo's body are way too big to fit through these tiny doorways. But water molecules are super small and fit perfectly through them. Only water can move easily in and out of a fish's body. Nature wants everything to even out, and the only way you can balance this is for water to start pouring into Nemo's body. Well, Nemo has so much salt compared to the fresh water surrounding him that the water just keeps coming in his body. With this effect, Nemo may as well have been a blowfish instead of a clownfish, because he will swell up like a balloon. Eventually, he'll swell up so much that his cells will start to burst, until finally, he goes belly up. And doesn't really make for a very good balloon. This process of water flowing through these tiny doorways is called osmosis, and it's an amazing phenomenon. Don't put Nemo into a freshwater tank. He's a saltwater fish and needs to be surrounded by salt. The most important tip for our fishy friends out there, stay on osmosis' good side.
Okay. All right. I feel like I scarred you for life, and I didn't mean to. I didn't mean to. The context that they're teaching is why you need to put freshwater fish and freshwater, saltwater fish. So if you have fish at home, I need this to strike your memory every time you walk home and see your fish, right? Notice you didn't get any scientific words until the very end. This process is called osmosis. They talked about the semi-permeable membrane, random kinetic motion. There was some mistakes in there, by the way, conceptually. But overall, the ideas first, language second, right? So this is disaggregate instruction. And so what we found was it was effective in 3 studies. We did classroom studies with teachers. We did this first experiment. And effect sizes for the first time were incredible. 1.74 was for which is almost 2 standard deviations with a small intervention of about 30 minutes. And so what we were finding was that it's the DUS study, teach with simple language, kids learn better. So we also were curious about whether or not the emotional aspect of this language identity dilemma could be assessed. Same exact process. One group got simple language first, the other group got the combination of academic terms and everyday language, and then an outcome we gave them 2 psychological measures. So I want to show you that really quickly. So here's our intervention. So it is just a picture with the voiceover. That was my voice. On the left, evaporation happens when water changes its shape. On the right, when water evaporates, expands its bond length and changes to gaseous form, right? One more scientific, one simpler. And so what we did is had them watch the video about the water cycle, and then we gave them 2 types of tests. And so if you're unfamiliar with these, you've probably seen these before. A Stroop test, these are cognitive distractors. And here, let me explain it this way. When you park your car, you're trying to parallel park. If you don't have one of those fancy cars, it does it for you, right? Sometimes you turn your music down. All right? You can park the car without turning the music down, but what you're literally are doing is freeing cognitive space. We're reducing the distractions. And so these are stress measures. And so you can't biologically measure stress without like getting biological data. Try going through our IRB with that, and so we move past that. So we use these cognitive load measures. And so, for example, the word for a Stroop test, the word red could be written in red. If it's written in red, you push the R button. And so that's called a congruent. The letters match the color. But there could be an incongruent. So the word red could be written in blue letters. So now I have to ignore what it says and push the B button because the color is blue, but the word is red. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So congruent, the 2 things match, right? Incongruent, I have to ignore one distractor to then focus. So this is a flanker test, same principle. So you have to push the button of the centermost arrow. So if you notice here, the centermost arrow is pointed that direction. So this is incongruent. I need to ignore what's there and recognize that there's one arrow going the opposite direction. So congruent, if all the arrows are pointed the same way, I push that button. So here's the issue. Congruent assessments are easier. incongruent are more complicated because I have to turn down the distractor. So all we did was had the kids watch this video, right? Simple language, complex language, and then we gave them these stress measures. And so here's some of the results. And so if you take a look here for the Stroop, and that is the one with the colors, the treatment group, their average time was 1,300 milliseconds. So that's our experimental group. The average time for the control group is 1,700 milliseconds. And so the treatment group was faster in their capacity to recognize this at a 0.77, which is a strong effect size, right? We're talking about 3/4 of a standard deviation. Now, this is a 15 to 20 minute intervention. It's not a long thing that we're doing. So similarly, congruent items. Treatment group, 1185 and 1285. You notice a smaller effect size. And so here's what that means. When it was easy, the arrows were the same way, the colors are the same, they are similar, but the treatment group did better. When it was complicated, the treatment group did much better. So that would be great, right? We danced a little bit when we saw that data. But we looked at the second set of tests. So also look, 93 points. I got a rejection from JARS when I published this first time. I'll just be full transparency. They said the percentages are accurate more often for the control group. And I wanted to be like, you big dummies. They got it right because they took longer, because it was harder for them. You can get it right. All I need to do is figure out what color it is, right? The point is not the percentage of accuracy, but the rate, right? But I love those editors are great friends of mine. It's not a big deal, right? This is published, by the way, in Science Education. So it came out last year. So again, 600 milliseconds treatment group, 1100 for the control group, exact same pattern. So here's what we're noticing is just by teaching with complex language, you are literally taking up cognitive space. Right? So the argument for us, there's something cognitive happening here as well through using complex language. So we got a long way to go. I want to keep moving. Do you remember these things? So this is not a rhetorical question. I need the answer. At what point was it when you deleted all the other information in your brain? You had everybody's number. There was a time when you can say, what's Bob's phone number? And I could rattle off the phone number, right? And now I don't remember those numbers. Someone tell me why. Don't need them, too many passwords. But here's the question. When did that happen? Look, your faces are hilarious. I gotta tell you, this is a funny group.
I don't know if I ever deleted any numbers. It's just that the new numbers, I never remembered them.
Correct. So I would argue, mom, closest relative, you know that person's number. Still.
Yeah. Yes.
Siblings, maybe. Friends. But I used to remember my friend's phone number. I'm going somewhere. This computer on your shoulder has an amazing cache. What's the word? Cache or cache? Cache deletion feature, right? So all things unnecessary will be deleted. It's just a fact. I will also argue the minute you can scroll down your phone and push the button when it was all in one, not when you had a Palm Pilot and had to look it up and then punch the phone number in. So some of you don't know what a Palm Pilot was. It was an organizer thing that had the phone numbers, but it wasn't a part of the phone. So you had to look there and then punch the phone number in. There's a process of punching the phone number in that produces the understanding, right? So the argument for me is the minute we didn't need to do it, so here's what I'm saying. The knowledge that we don't apply regularly is what gets deleted. Gene Lave talked about it a long time ago, situated cognition, the argument, what's my guy at San Diego? Michael Cole talks about the digital devices and how when there's a necessity feature that happens. So here's my message to you, is that we will always delete unnecessary information. So part of what has to happen in our teaching is creating generative opportunities, right? So we're asking teachers to learn how learning works. And we're really shocked that we don't train teachers how learning works, so that every teacher every morning, if you're in 9th grade, my poor children, they get up and they go to school and the history teacher's like, this is the most important thing ever. I want to tell you about Roman civilization. They go to English and they say, this argumentative essays, you'll be using these forever. This is the most important thing, right? Then they go to math and, the lie continues throughout the day. So the question is, how can I remember it? If I'm going to delete it anyway, then context matters, right? And so part of what we're saying is teaching happens in situations where students can't forget the content. And so I need to create opportunity for students to sustain it. And so, for example, this is my osmosis lesson. What do we have here? Chicken. Obviously it's chicken, right? But it's also marinade. So if marinade works, if you're going to marinate, anybody in here marinate food before? This is a healthy barbecuing and cooking region. I was confident. This doesn't go well in Palo Alto, I got to tell you. Right? So if you marinate the chicken, you're assuming that the seasonings are going to get inside the food, at least underneath the skin at some level, right? So is this not osmosis? So the argument for us, if you situate this science knowledge in this context, I need students to explain over and over again. And my friend in the back, you got it, right? Once they understand it, I need to give them another context so they can explain it. Now, why? Because as they're walking to the grocery store with grandma, I need them to say, you know, the reason why they spray the vegetables at Kroger and Meijer is because these vegetables are dead and we want them to look as fresh as possible. That's osmosis happening, right? So NGSS is taking us here. They're saying we need to teach in context. And my argument is this will give them the language resources to talk about the phenomena, but here's what we need teachers to do. I need to understand where the content lives in the lives of these young people. So I'm not going to teach a concept about spraying the vegetables at the grocery store when all of my kids go to bodegas and they don't go to grocery stores, right? Similarly, when we talk about hydrogen bonding, right, why humidity will literally break the bonds in your hair. So if you flat iron your hair, you curled your hair, you go outside, right, these hydrostatic bonds, weak polar bonds, because water has a positive and negative side, you're going to break the bonds in your hair. You tell me a young person who will forget on a humid day, especially if they're wearing hair wraps at night to make sure their hair doesn't change. If I'm teaching in the context of their lives, right, they can learn and they won't forget it. It's generative, but here's the problem. Our teachers need to be deeply rooted in the culture of their kids. They need to have the language practices to understand what's happening, and we need to be intentional about learning. So I'm coming to the close of my time. I want to share some new things that we're doing. So we published a study in equity and ethics education to talk about how part of what we can do in digital textbooks is address the deficit in teachers of color. Here's how we're going to address it. By not saying we can do that today. But what I can do is make sure the images in the digital text look like the kids in the classroom. And so we did a study to do racial matching. And so we gave the control group had white teachers. Everyone uniformly had white female teachers because that's the most likely teaching assignment that they would have. The other group got teachers that looked like them. And so if you wore a hijab, the teacher in your book wore a hijab. And it was difficult to find these people, but we did it. And what we found was no significant learning differences, but we found a shift in attitudes towards science. One group had a significant learning difference, and that was Southeast Asian students. And our thought was this is probably the group that is least likely to see themselves in media, right? And so we're struggling with that. But here's the message. We need to think more creatively about what we can do with race and culture in the way that we teach. And this last thing is we have a series of studies about virtual reality. And so we're using culturally relevant virtual reality. And so instead of taking kids out into the community and taking them to the pyramids of Giza through VR, what you can do is take them through their local grocery store and teach them the science that's happening there. So I want to close with giving you a snapshot of what that might look like. So quickly, we're also trying to send messages of belonging. So subtly, instead of a British accent, I have Kendrick Lamar playing in the background. I have a young woman of color who's doing the voiceover, so we want them to subtly hear you're part of this community. So what you're gonna see, we take them into the local grocery store. They've learned a lesson about food chains. They're now counting the number of fast food restaurants in their neighborhood and the number of dialysis centers in their neighborhood. And their final assessment is to talk about food health and food chains as it's connected to neighborhood community health. So here it goes. right, so you get it, right? So we have a curriculum with 4 lessons where there's 4 VR videos using these same principles. We just started a website. We're working on smartphone enhanced science education that is culturally relevant and culturally engaging. So scienceinthecity.stanford.edu, and we're building that out because we believe technology can be a bridge. Is we have a common curriculum, or at least a curriculum that is that's adjustable, that teachers will have the resources that they need. We know too much about good teaching. We know too much about how to make things cultural and gender relevant, and we just don't share it. We make everyone reproduce those same processes. So we're working on that. And a final message is that as you're working on this, you don't need to be technologically proficient, because you know who is? Your students. They are phenomenal at building technology. And so I guess the message is, think about how technology can serve as a bridge moving us forward. So I have one question to ask, is that let this be one of many conversations that we have about science education. I've been at this 17 years now, 16 years at Stanford, and I'm frustrated, right? My greatest paper might get published, read by 300 people, right? Who cares about that? I need teachers to know what's going on. I need to get engaged in the community, and so let's make this the first of many conversations. I thank you for having me back. It's been fun. Thank you very much.
So great, so now we have plenty of time for questions and answers, so please ask Bryan your questions, and we got to 1:30, I believe, right?
Fabulous stuff, just fantastic. One of the things we really struggle with in elementary is the push with the literacy folks, who tend to really want to push the vocabulary and foregrounding it. And so I'm wondering what kind of conversations you've had with other educators in literacy, and even around the policy-making decisions of prioritizing that piece of the world.
Great question. So what I've done in the last 7 years, I developed a group of people that I work with. So my Science in the City teaching fellows. So these are science teachers that say, hey, we'll work with you. We exchange ideas. So I give them the VR. They say, no, don't do it that way. Do it this way. And so they consult and give us guidance. And so we talked about this very issue. And so I said, well, our research says idea first, language second. And they say, you're wrong. The elementary research says language first, right? So then the discussion is, well, you're not giving them new ideas. So the difference is that we're starting with new ideas. So if you teach the science first, meaning the idea first, and then you're then asking them to apply the language, how is it deficient? What is the problem that you're establishing by teaching the idea first? And I've never heard an argument for what the problem is, right? So I guess the message is, I talk to them about how language works. We always talk about acquisition versus learning. So if you ask them, if you wanted to learn a foreign language, what would you do? Uniformly, they all say, go to another country, be forced to use the language. I'm arguing the exact same thing. Take one step though. Make sure the idea has some foundation through simple language, and then let them talk through fluency. And so we've come to agreement. Now policy, I'm discouraged. I don't think I'll have any impact on policy regardless of what the data says, but that is what it is. Yeah.
So it's interesting, you would think your research that you just showed us would influence the policymakers, because it shows that teaching the language first doesn't result in kids learning.
Yeah.
So why, I mean, I struggle as much as Christina does with this issue. We all do, right? And so the language people want to push the language first, and the science educators are saying, oh, let's get them to experience this stuff. Let's them get the idea, and then we can put the label on it. And the research, it clearly shows, I mean, your research, other research, clearly shows that's the good way to go. So why would you think that's the case?
I had optimism when this study was replicated. So there's a person named Rinke in Holland, Olander, and then Carl Wyman replicated it at the university level. So it's been replicated by other people. And we did 3 different studies. So, and Carl Wyman has a Nobel Prize, and he was working at NSF and has a voice in policy. I'm not sure. I think part of what I've learned from policymakers is oftentimes they want information to validate their passion, their direction. It's not the other way around. So I think the building of relationships with policymakers is probably going to have to precede just giving them validated instruments or data and research that says there's a better way to do it.
So I'm a PhD candidate here. My work looks at students taking up discourse, scientific discourse in classrooms, And I look at the like latter piece of this and how teachers are scaffolding after students have ideas to actually allow students to access and use scientific discourse. Do you think about that part of the story? It seems like you're focused on the prior part, so I'm curious.
No, absolutely.
When you get into like adding in the complex language and how to do that in a way that works well.
So we've been looking at technology because part of the concern for us is in most classrooms you have one speaker. Even in small group settings, you ask a group of 3 to do something, one person takes on most of the roles. Now with a smartphone, we use a software. I don't know if Nearpod has any success out here. Nearpod? Okay. So Nearpod is a big deal in the South and has started to take hold in San Francisco. So essentially, I can turn all of your phones into a device and I can control them. So I can swipe the screen, hit a button and say, give me your response, and then everybody can. And so what we can do is to say, talk about this idea, and I can anonymize the responses, and so everybody is able to talk about it. So the teachers in our group are playing with activities that are efficient. So part of their concern is, I need something that can happen in a 2-minute window where everybody's responding, and then I can give real-time feedback. And so we've been working with technology to see if we can pull that off.
This is not exactly a question, but I want to confirm what you said in 2 different places. 2 years ago, I went to a couple different researchers who had expertise in vocabulary acquisition. And I specifically, and it was an ELA workshop, but I went there because I wanted to answer this question. And so what they told me in all cases is that they have not seen any research that shows that it is better for students to learn the vocabulary first as opposed to later. So they said, no, actually, we can't stand for that viewpoint that you should front load it. But the second thing I can tell you is that as a teacher, I taught science for 20 years, but I was also a German teacher for 20 years. And I argued the very same point. I said, if we're going to teach children vocabulary, we might be able to teach them, let's say, a certain number of new words a day, and that's research-based, but we only teach them words for things that they already understand and they already have a concept for.
Yeah.
We don't teach them words that they have absolutely no concept for. And as a German student in Germany, I took physics for the first time, and I had to learn all kinds of words in physics that I had no English comprehension for, that I didn't know what they were talking about. And that has cemented so much of what you've said for me as a learner and also as a teacher.
Yeah. One of the most heartbreaking discoveries for me is I was writing my dissertation, and I came across the work of A.B. Ahrens, Arnold Ahrens. Anybody know his work? Physicist in 1973 saying the exact same thing. And I was like, I just replicated a study. I used different methods, but he was talking about this in the 70s, right? It just hadn't had any traction. And so part of what I think I find is when I go talk about these places, I get universal agreement. People say, well, except for people who read, there's a particular research group out of Harvard that was doing some studies around the word first, and so they've been successful in communicating their message. So my argument is that try it, right? That's all I can offer at this particular point. But the language acquisition people in general are warm to it, but I'm not sure. I guess this goes back to a bigger issue. How well we're communicating theory to practice from researchers to teachers, I think that relationship needs to get better.
How do you support the teachers to, especially teachers who are already in the classroom, to help them adjust their lens and understand that and value the wonderful and rich resources that the students bring so that they can do this kind of work?
Yeah. That's a great question. So part of what we do is I try not to demonize the teachers. Like, you've been doing it wrong. That's a big mistake. The first thing we do is talk about pedagogical content knowledge. It's like the first thing I need to do is find science phenomena in the lives of the kids so that I know where they'll encounter it, right? The second is to teach them how to disaggregate. And so part of what I do, I think has been effective, is to not bring forth the idea of learning first. I always get them to say it. And so if I say, when we talk about so I just did a workshop 2 weeks ago, and I used Nearpod. Tell me how learning works is the first question. And I have them say it. Then I say, if I needed to learn a new language, what would I do? And then uniformly, it is all practice, is situations drive learning. So I use their understanding of learning to say, okay, you already know So let's just make an adjustment. And that has been successful for me in professional development context, but I don't do a lot of professional development. And so part of what we need is better infrastructures for in-service teachers to have the kind of support where they can continue to learn and learn more efficiently to adopt practices. And it's going to sound crazy, but wouldn't it be great that if there was free curriculum materials that you could just download and learn and use? That would be awesome. So we have an app that we've built and we're piloting right now. That app, that's what it's supposed to do, but we're not ready yet.
Thank you. This is brilliant. I'm intrigued by the part of, similar to the last question, how teachers come to know students well enough to be able to create opportunities for them to jump in where they are.
Good.
And to, at the same time, avoid projecting onto them scenarios that they think they know about them.
Absolutely.
Because if you come and talk about Nemo in certain contexts, the kids are going to look at you like you're crazy.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right? So what in your work have you learned about the ways that teachers learn to organically, to borrow where you started, to build from students to do this work?
So that to me is the easiest part, is we do pre-assessment to understand what students know conceptually. So how come context-wise, that's not what we're doing? So we, for every unit, ask our teachers, we need to find out where the content lives in their lives, what language resources they have to support these ideas, and then where they're most intrigued about a concept. And so you need to create pre-assessments for every unit to get a sense of who your students are and where science might live. And so that's actually how we found out about, I use the example of hydrogen bonding and changing hair texture. Is one of the issues around water was that what the students in the pre-assessment were like, you know, I hate when I get my hair done and then it's a humid day, right? And so that's where we were like, oh, there's a great lesson in that, because that is the awareness of water and focus on water, right, is connected to a very real science concept. So then what concept will drive that? Hydrogen bonding is the easy way to teach it, right? So the point is, it's the work of the teacher to do the investigating of their students, and it shouldn't be abstracted. It's still pre-assessment, but make sure pre-assessment is not purely cognitive, it's also cultural.
Is there a way to try and immerse the students in their own kind of learning by using augmented reality instead of virtual reality, whereby, you know, for example, if you run around a grocery store or something like that, or a convenience store, coding, you know, barcodes are universal, right? So you could attach all those barcodes to information that the students are engaging with, learning about.
Yeah.
You know, healthy food.
I have a student, Ekta Shaw, who will be graduating fairly soon, who's using an app called Streetwise for youth participatory action research. And so they can go around, label communities, and they're looking for science phenomena. They're studying asthma rates and causes and things that might be associated with asthma rates. And so she has an app that's doing that work. I don't know of anyone other than Nicole Pinkert who's trying to play with that idea, but I don't know that actually there's a software yet. I think this is where our ed tech has to be better, right? So it's a great idea, but someone's got to develop the software. So I know of one in play right now, and it's going okay. It's going okay. There and yeah.
In the transition from common language to the more scientific one, do students, like in your area or the way you do it, get any historical context why the scientific language is annoying the way it is, and like a little bit of historical context why at all the reason to use this annoying terminology in German?
So good question. So I don't know. I mean, we train the teachers to do it, but then teachers develop their own approaches. So I'm not sure. I think the thing that we're asking teachers to do is to make sure students get practice using language, but also they get to fail, right? So if you're using the language and using it wrong, that's how you become fluent. And so that's the foundation, is make sure they are asked to use the science language and expect them to use it wrong. But in terms of focusing on why, I'm not sure. I did in my dissertation study ask students about science language, and one of the things that they were very explicit about is that they understood the value of science language. And so I think it could be done, but I haven't seen. We don't do that. It's not something that's part of our practice.
So your big statement here was ideas first, followed by language.
Yes.
Language, right?
Yes.
But I'm going to just modify it a little bit. But in that idea first, I also heard you talking about kids experiencing lots of phenomena.
Oh yeah.
right? So part of getting the idea across is actually having kids experience phenomena. And so you can comment on that.
Absolutely. That's the critique that I get. Aren't you talking about direct, linear, teacher-centered learning? I'm like, absolutely not. You still want the kids to engage in phenomena, to try to explain phenomena. So it's phenomena-centered. The layer is that we're explicit about what we're doing with language. And so absolutely, I'm a believer in the use of argumentation practices. And here's why. Is when kids are looking for information, they're going to YouTube. It's more important now to discern why something is accurate and something is inaccurate than to be able to just get that information. And so what I'm arguing is every class there should be phenomena that the kids are using and applying and discussing. Absolutely.
But I also heard you say, but not all phenomena are equal.
No, they're not.
Right, because this is your idea of using the person's hair, getting their hair done on a humid day. It's like a disaster for some people, right?
Yeah.
So what would be your criteria? Maybe it's too much, but what are some of your criteria that you would give? Like, how do we pick phenomena that might be appropriate?
Good question. So, the realist in me says what I can afford to have available to my kids, right? So that's always a teacher's dilemma. What can I do, right? The second is, are these things that they can transfer to local context, right? And so the more I see it, the easier it is for me to remember it. And so phenomena that are centered in the largest group of students in the classroom, that they're more likely to consider and experience, those are the best phenomena to teach. And we're going to have some challenges with that as we are engaged in NGSS implementation, as teachers are looking for phenomena, right? So where does that phenomena exist in the lives of the kids? I, as a teacher, I probably come from a different culture. I now have to do some serious pedagogical content knowledge work to figure out, well, how can I teach like protein synthesis, one of the worst for me. Where does protein synthesis live in the lives of these kids? How can I teach that in a way where they'll never forget it, right? It's work. I want to offer an answer. I have a couple ideas, but now I'm assessing the kids in the room. Where might this happen most regularly in their lives, right? The kids I had in Long Beach, big time, vain, super vain. So I could do protein diets. I could talk about weight loss, catabolism, and anabolism, and really get into protein synthesis and how that matters. And that could be the phenomenon. We can root it in that. But I need to make sure first I select something that lives in the lives of the kids, and then I need to be able to afford to do it in my classroom.
Thank you for the great talk. It was so interesting. I would like to learn a little bit about how these language strategies help students to construct their identities in this learning setting.
Good.
So you also make some reference about this Naila Nasir. I really like also her
Me too.
study in terms of this identity resources.
Yeah.
Also, would you connect these ideas to your work, or how would you define this identity construction?
Great question. Great question. So we don't talk about it directly, like I haven't done a study dedicated to it, but there's a shift in the discursive norm. So if I'm the person using science language, because the teacher said, okay, now all of us are using science language to describe phenomena, the cost of being the kid who's using science language is dramatically different than if I'm just really working hard and I'm the person using science language. So by changing the cultural norms where everybody in the classroom is now using science language, right or wrong, it changes the cultural cost of using science language. And so can I see myself as a scientist? Well, if I'm using science language, engaged in science phenomena, I would argue it's probably more likely that you feel comfortable. At least you set a norm. Because if you don't do it, then you allow the cultural norms of the environment to frame that. And Randy Yerrick and Andy Gilbert did a study a long time ago around how if kids had to use science language, there was a cultural cost to doing so. And so the message is, whatever the societal stereotypes about language, cognition, and culture are, they're going to show up in the classroom unless the teacher has an explicit agenda to do so. Right? My argument, teachers should set the norms. Okay. Last question.
Have you done any studies similar to this in classrooms where there are multiple languages?
Every classroom I've ever been in. Yeah. So all of my studies are in Oakland, San Francisco Bay Area, LA. So there's half of the kids speak Spanish.
Yeah.
Right. Thank you. Appreciate it.
We always give a little gift to our speakers.
Appreciate it, Joe. Thank you.
It was a great talk. It was really fun. I
appreciate it.
Enjoyed your enthusiasm.
Trying
Right?
to keep people awake. Yeah.
Really important to keep